I'm James Miranda.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 12. Man Down. Maryland-Pennsylvania border. Camp David. Marine 1 turned hard as it swooped low, flying just above the treetops. The warning alarms in the cockpit blared as the pilots deftly maneuvered the helicopters to the nearby presidential retreat of Camp David. "Why are we not heading to Raven Rock?" the president asked Bill, the head of his Secret Service detail. The helicopter circled the helipad at the facility and prepared to settle down. Turning to face the president, Bill replied, "Enemy fighters are in the area. One of the helicopters that were carrying a group of staffers from the Pentagon was just shot down as it approached Site R." The president's eyes grew wide as saucers as he realized how close they had just come to dying. There had to be close to a dozen helicopters heading to Raven Rock at that moment. As the helicopter landed at the helipad, a contingent of heavily armed Marines ran forward and fanned out to set up a perimeter around Marine 1 as it landed and promptly turned its engines off. A second later, one of the Secret Service agents opened the side door and scanned the area to make sure it was safe. He then nodded to Bill, who guided the president out of the helicopter. The group then made their way to the Aspen Lodge, which was where the president and his family would typically stay when they bedded down at the presidential retreat. Walking into the lodge, the Secret Service agents spread out and secured the inside of the building, while the Marines established an outer perimeter. They relocated small squads to various defensive positions around the camp while they tried to figure out what to do next. The camp wasn't exactly a defensible position where they could keep the president long-term, but with enemy fighters in the nearby area, it wasn't safe to move him via helicopter. One of the Marine majors, who was the commander of the Marine contingent at the camp, made a side comment to Bill. Despite the fact that the president had begun a conversation with General Peterson, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who was being fed information by phone from someone at the Pentagon, Sachs could overhear the major say, "Sir, we could move the president to the tram and get him to Raven Rock that way." Bill paused as he thought about that for a moment. Then he cleared his throat and approached the president and General Peterson. "Excuse me, Mr. President. We're going to go ahead and move you over to the camp commander's quarters. The entrance to the tunnel is inside one of the rooms there. We'll be able to evacuate you to Site R via that route. It's a more secured location than where we are now." The Marine major interjected, "I've got a platoon of Marines heading over here quickly. I recommend we wait to move the president until they get here." Even inside the lodge, they could occasionally hear the scream of aircraft high above. From time to time, they heard a distant explosion, signaling that a plane or missile had exploded. The man who always traveled with the president, who had the nuclear football attached to him, looked uncharacteristically nervous. The president turned to face his senior military advisor. "I thought this place would be safe, General. We should have gone to the Peacock at the White House." Turning deadly serious, General Peterson pulled his cell phone down to his shoulder. "Washington was just hit by a barrage of cruise missiles, Mr. President. I'm still trying to get some details, but from what I've learned, they've hit the Pentagon pretty hard as well as the Eisenhower Executive Building next to the White House. It was good to get you out of D.C., sir. They were clearly trying to hit you with one of those missiles." Turning beet red, the president felt his temper start to flare. He smacked his fist on the table so hard that it was a wonder nothing broke, and let out a stream of obscenities. "Whose planes hit us?" he demanded. General Peterson shook his head. "I don't know yet. It doesn't matter, Mr. President. We need to get you to the bunker. where we can find out what in the world is going on and organize a better response." Just as the president was about to demand that they get a move on, the Marine Major and Bill both put a hand to their earpieces, as if they were trying to hear a message better. Bill's face became a bit pale as he looked at the Marine and just nodded. Bill turned to General Peterson and the president. "We have to go now. We've got movement on the perimeter." "What the hell? Do they know we have the president here?" demanded Peterson. He looked nervously over at the naval officer who was carrying the nuclear football. "I don't know. Let's get going," Bill replied. He motioned for the other agents to start moving. The group headed for the door that led to the driveway. As soon as they exited the building, the president saw that 2 of their up-armored SUVs had just arrived. The vehicles would take them the short distance to the camp commander's quarters, where the underground tram was located. Bam! Boom! Bam! Rat-a-tat, rat-a-tat, rat-a-tat. Out of nowhere, a series of loud explosions shook the ground, and machine guns roared to life. The president felt as though his stomach dropped out of his body. "Engage them now! Breach the perimeter!" shouted the German KSK commander, Oberstleutnant Rainer Hardbrod, over their secured radios. Thump, thump, thump. The mortar team started dropping rounds in the direction of the Aspen Lodge and pool area. 4 separate squads of German commandos then rapidly advanced on the perimeter of the presidential retreat. Several loud shots rang out as their snipers engaged the roving patrols of Secret Service and Marine Guards on the perimeter. In seconds, the crescendo of gunfire picked up pace until it became a near continuous roar of smaller popping sounds. Small-caliber pistols, American M4s, German HK-416s, and the heavier chattering sounds of the German MG5 short-barreled light machine guns all added to the growing cacophony. Shouts in German echoed through the barren woods as the various commando teams coordinated their firing lanes and covering maneuvers as they advanced on the small pockets of defenders at the perimeter. Running to keep up with his forces, Oberstleutnant Hardbrod instinctively ducked just as a string of rounds flew right over his head. Pieces of a tree rained down on him as a Marine rifleman laid into his position. "Lay down suppressive fire. This position is under attack," he shouted to several of his soldiers nearby. They heard his orders and instantly jumped up with their rifles at the ready, charging the 2 Marines that had pinned him and one of his other soldiers down. "Grenade!" one of them shouted. A few seconds later, they heard a bang. "They're flanking us!" shouted one of the Marines. That yell was followed by a long string of automatic machine gun fire. Sticking his head above the fallen tree trunk where he had taken cover, Hardbrod brought his rifle to bear and sighted in on a Marine who appeared to be coordinating their defense. He depressed the trigger and swiftly sent several well-aimed rounds into the man's chest. The Marine fell backwards from the hit and didn't move or attempt to get back up. "Fire!" he shouted as his guys bounded forward. 2 guys laid into the American Marines, sending as much lead at them as they could, while 4 other guys advanced, 2 on each side of their flanks. Then those attackers fired a magazine's worth of ammo at the American positions, while the guys in the center advanced. In short order, the German commandos had finally breached the perimeter of the camp along Park Central Road, near the skeet shooting range. Crump, crump, crump. Hardbrod's mortar team fired off their 3rd volley of mortars into the camp, hoping to cause further chaos and distract the defenders so they wouldn't know exactly where the main attack was coming from. With his first team advancing through the skeet shooting range, Hardbrod sent a message to his second team to advance swiftly and follow through the newly created hole in the perimeter before additional help could arrive and box them in. Hardbrod pulled a flare gun out of his trouser pocket. He aimed it high in the air and fired off the blue flare, signaling that they had breached the perimeter. Seconds later, more gunfire erupted, this time from the opposite side of the presidential retreat. Hardbrod smiled. The Russian Spetsnaz team had started their attack. The entire camp was now a chaotic melee of machine gun fire, explosions, and shouting in English, German, and Russian as 3 highly trained groups of soldiers and Secret Service agents fought over the life of the American president and control of the nuclear football. "Quickly, we have to move," Bill shouted. He threw the president into the back of the up-armored suburban SUV with a force that was almost violent. A handful of Marines ran ahead of the vehicle on either side of the road. Machine gun fire seemed to be erupting everywhere and nowhere all at once. The angry shouts for help in English and foreign languages, and the noise of constant shooting echoed off the barren trees, intermixed with the sudden explosions that rocked the area. "Holy crap, those are mortars!" shouted the driver. One of the agents jumped into the back of the vehicle with the president. Hot pieces of shrapnel bounced off the armor and splintered one of the passenger windows. The naval officer with the nuclear football had been thrown in the chase vehicle, along with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. With everyone in the vehicles, the driver floored it and zoomed past the group of Marines who were doing their best to run ahead and clear a path for them. Just as they rounded the corner in the road, placing them no more than 100 meters from the building they needed to reach, a loud metal crunching sound overwhelmed their senses. A string of bullets had pounded the side of the armored vehicle. Then the bulletproof glass of the windshield was suddenly turned into a series of spider webs. A cluster of bullets had pounded the brittle outer layer, shattering the outside of the window in circular patterns around the points of impact. So far, the inner layer of the windshield continued to absorb the energy of the impacts, but even the most bullet-resistant glass in the world would eventually reach a breaking point. "Hold on!" shouted the driver. He instinctively ducked down a bit behind the steering wheel as he gunned the vehicle for all it was worth. The engine roared. Bill began to worry that the many bullets hitting the front of the vehicle would punch their way through the front armor and into the engine block. As they zipped past whoever had been shooting at them, the side of their vehicle got stitched up by more rounds. Bullets peppered the armored doors and thudded into the bulletproof glass windows, partially shattering them, but not yet breaching the vehicle. Behind them, the squad of Marines that had been chasing after them down the road opened fire on the attackers, doing their best to provide covering fire for the Secret Service. The vehicles came to a grinding halt less than 20 feet from the commander's quarters as their engine suddenly gave out and their tires were completely shot to pieces. Once the vehicle stopped moving, 4 Marines spilled out of the building, killing 3 of the attackers who were continuing to empty their magazines into the president's vehicle. More and more commandos converged on the building, tearing into the Marines who were doing their best to create a perimeter. The driver of the vehicle looked at Bill. "I'll cover you," he shouted. "Get the president out of here." The man then pushed with all his body weight against the badly damaged driver's side door and hopped out of the vehicle. He quickly brought his FN P90 submachine gun to his shoulder and sprayed 2 surprised attackers at near point-blank range. With those assailants down, the agent swapped out the magazine and sprinted to the other side of the SUV to help cover the president. One of the Marines nearby yelled, "Frag out!" He threw a grenade in the direction of several enemy soldiers who were doing their best to flank their position and get at the president. The enemy commandos broke cover as they sought to dive away from the grenade. That brief moment of weakness was all the Secret Service driver needed to get a bead on one of them and lay into the enemy soldier with a short burst of fire. The commando fell to the ground like a dropped doll. "Get the president inside!" yelled one of the agents. 3 more Secret Service agents spilled out of the chase vehicle along with General Peterson and the naval officer, who was clutching the nuclear football for all his worth. The man ran like an all-star halfback as he clutched at the leather-bound case. Dirt, pieces of pavement, snow, and ice kicked up all around him as he ran for the door to the building that had been left open by the Marines. "Covering fire!" shouted one of the Marines. 3 of them jumped up from behind their covered position. They proceeded to empty their magazines at the attackers, while 2 of the Secret Service agents joined in. Bill and the remaining 3 agents did their best to run with the president to the open door, shielding him with their bodies. The enemy soldiers must have seen what was happening. They increased their fire and aimed right for the agents who were rushing the president to cover. One of the agents was hit multiple times in the back and stopped running. The body armor he wore was no match for the armor-piercing rounds the assault teams were using. In a desperate last act, he tried to straighten himself up so his body would continue to absorb more rounds and prevent them from hitting the president. A somewhat large projectile flew past them and slammed into the wall of the building, 10 feet to the left of the door, and exploded. The force of the blast knocked them backwards to the ground, showering them with shrapnel and debris. A huge chunk of the building was suddenly a gaping hole as fire and wreckage rained down on the ground. The group of Marines that had been running down the road behind them had finally caught up to them and opened fire on the attackers from the rear, catching them in a nasty crossfire from their front and rear positions. One of the Marines saw the mass of bodies lying in the open area of the road, just in front of the building, and knew the president was among them, along with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He ran toward them, firing his rifle the entire way. When he reached the pile of bodies, he threw 2 of the gravely wounded Secret Service agents off the president. He looked down and saw Sachs. He had a wild and bewildered look of fear and anger on his face, blood streaking down his cheeks and from his ears. The Marine reached down and grabbed the president by his jacket, practically yanking him off the ground and to his feet. He shoved the president hard toward the door, doing everything in his power to get Sachs inside the safety of the building while making sure his body, which was covered in his body armor, was between the president and the commandos trying to kill them. Bullets continued to whip all around the 2 of them as they ran the last 20 feet to get inside the commander's quarters. Another Marine from inside the structure jumped out and fired a string of rounds at an attacker behind them as he yelled, "Hurry up!" The 2 of them jumped into the building and ducked down behind the wall as several bullets slapped into the structure, punching more holes through the wood. Suddenly, dozens of rounds hit the building, breaking the glass windows and showering them with chunks of broken glass and fragments of timber, plaster, and drywall. The structure was being shredded by the relentless torrent of bullets. "Where's General Peterson?" shouted the president as he finally collected his wits. "Crap!" yelled one of the Marines. He stuck his head around the door to look back at the pile of bodies 20 feet away. "I see him. He's injured. Cover me," shouted the Marine. He jumped back to his feet and ran at full speed for the general. Several of his buddies fired at the attackers as he rushed forward. Bullets continued to fly at an enormous rate. A moment later, the Marine entered the door of the commander's quarters with General Peterson's arm over his shoulder. It was almost as if a guardian angel had somehow prevented them from getting hit during their mad dash back. As soon as they made it back inside, they heard more shouting, and the volume of enemy fire seemed to increase. The attackers were clearly closing in on the building. Soon, they would breach it. Crump! A grenade went off against the wall of the building, blowing even more holes in the structure and rattling them hard inside. "We have to get the president to the tram now!" shouted the only Secret Service agent who had made it into the building. He was helping the naval officer with the nuclear football move down the hallway toward the secret room with the tunnel. "You men cover the door in the hallway. I'll help General Peterson," the president said. He pulled the man's arm over his shoulder, and the 2 of them moved with a purpose down the hallway after the Secret Service agent. "Hang in there, Austin. You aren't dying on me today," the president told his friend as they walked. The 3 Marines left alive in the building were doing their best to shoot out of the windows at the attackers. The commandos had now made it up to the 2 armored SUVs, having killed the remaining Secret Service agents and Marine guards outside the building. The group of Marines attacking from the rear section were doing their best to break through the attackers and get to the building, but they appeared to be heavily engaged and unable to get to their position. It was now up to these 3 Marines inside to hold the building long enough for the president to get away. the lone surviving Secret Service agent reached the entrance of the secret room that led down to the tunnel. He entered a passcode, which unlocked the door. Once it was opened, the four of them went inside, and the agent turned around and pulled the door closed. He hit another code, and the entrance automatically latched shut. Several cylinder locks dropped into the top and bottom of the metal door, making it nearly impossible to easily breach. A motion-activated light system came on and illuminated a set of stairs. The four of them walked down, with the echoes of gunfire and shouting still audible through the door, adding to their sense of urgency. Because of General Peterson's injuries, it took them a few minutes to get down to the bottom of the landing. When they walked into the next room, more lights turned on, and they saw a tram-like vehicle sitting on a set of rail tracks. The inside had a total of 10 seats. The Secret Service agent helped the naval officer with the football get strapped in, while the president helped General Peterson. Then the Secret Service agent and the president took care of their own seat belts. Looking at Sachs, the agent grinned and said, "Hold on, Mr. President. This is a very fast train ride." With that, he turned the system on. The tracks in front of them lit up. The agent applied power to the tram, and in the blink of an eye, the vehicle shot off at a speed of 70 miles per hour down the long, dark, damp tunnel. It would take them less than 5 minutes to travel the 7 miles underground to the Raven Rock facility, where they would hopefully be safe. Standing outside the building the Americans had rushed the president into, Oberstleutnant Rainer Hardbrod saw bodies everywhere. He had to give the Americans credit. They'd fought like devils against his men. They'd killed far more of his comrades than he'd thought possible, considering how few Marines and Secret Service agents were at the camp. "My men are still clearing the rest of the camp and the other buildings," said an imposing Russian colonel. "Did they get the president into the tunnel?" Sporadic gunfire continued to ring out as the few remaining defenders were pinned down and finished off. Neither side was taking prisoners. Smiling at the destruction their forces had just caused, Hardbrod turned to his Russian counterpart. "They did. It's time to get out of here. Mission complete." The Russian Spetsnaz nodded in agreement. He spoke a few commands into his radio, letting his nearby vehicle team know it was time to come pick them up. Now they needed to do their best to fade away into the shadows and get ready for their next operation. El Paso County, Colorado, NORAD facility. General Joseph Tibbets was not having a good day. As he walked into the main command room in the NORAD facility, he saw his worst fear starting to play out. Rather than launching the first attack and seizing the initiative from the enemy, as they had planned to do in 48 hours, the UN force, under General Guy Mackenzie, had beaten him to the punch. The aerial picture across the northern border of the country was starting to fill with combat aircraft. Worse, they had just received reports from the Navy that one of their carriers off the coast of Virginia was under attack, and a second carrier in the Pacific was reporting that they were being assailed as well. "I wasn't even supposed to be here," Tibbets found himself thinking. Just 5 months ago, General Tibbets had been on the verge of retiring after 34 years of service in the U.S. Army. At that time, he had been tired and, more importantly, dejected after a tough assignment as the last ground commander for operations in Afghanistan and Syria, as the U.S. concluded those wars. He had felt like a lot of business had been left undone, but he'd also agreed that it was time to leave. There wasn't a winning solution to those wars. When he returned from that overseas assignment, he had been assigned to Fort McNair and the United States Army Center of Military History. He was supposed to spend the last year of his time in the Army writing up the final lessons learned from the wars and postulating what could have been done early on and throughout the war to change the outcome. For millennia, philosophers had thought of war as an extension of a political disagreement. However, in the day and age of non-state actors, that belief didn't always hold true. Going back through all of his experiences honestly left him with more questions than answers, and he struggled with how to write or conclude his report. General Tibbet's retirement had been set for November 11th, Veterans Day. He'd figured he'd end his military career on a day that honored the soldiers he'd fought with and led for the last 34 years. Then the world around him had begun to implode as the nation he'd served so dutifully became rocked by terrorist attacks and marred by a coup d'etat, and his retirement had been rescinded. Shortly before Christmas, Tibbets had been summoned to the White House and found himself sitting in the Oval Office with the President and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. They told him what was happening and then asked him one simple question. How would you defend the country against the forces arrayed against America? He'd spent the next 2 hours outlining his strategy and vision for how he'd handle the UN force, and more importantly, the Chinese. A couple of days later, he'd been informed that he would replace the U.S. Northern Command commanding general and would be placed in charge of the defense of North America. It was a daunting task, further complicated by the fact that he had very little time to get himself familiar with his new command and to get the forces needed to win ready. However, like many generals who'd been given an insurmountable task, he determined that he would do his best and let the chips fall where they may. The red lights throughout the control room began to flash, and the missile launch alarms blared, pulling General Tibbets back to the present reality. One of the numerous screens zoomed in on a position just south of California, off the Mexican coast. "What type of missile just launched?" he bellowed. He rushed over to the Air Force technical sergeant who was monitoring that particular station. "It appears to be a ship-launched cruise missile, sir." There was a brief pause as he looked at more of the data. "The missile count is now rising above 20. They appear to be heading toward our naval facility in San Diego." The missile alarm blared again as the new launch site was identified. "I'm showing a missile launch directed at the Stennis Carrier Strike Group from that cluster of Chinese ships there," announced an Air Force captain who was manning one of the other stations. "Send flash warnings to those ships and naval facilities that we have confirmed cruise missile attacks heading for them," General Tibbets ordered. Turning to Brigadier General Estrada, who was the watch commander for the floor, Tibbets ordered, "Bring us to DEFCON 2 and alert the National Military Command Center that we have confirmed cruise missile attacks underway against our capital assets and facilities. I want all alert aircraft across the country scrambled and additional air assets to get airborne. Send a flash message to the FAA that effective immediately, they're to ground all air travel across the United States until further notice. All inbound flights to the United States are hereby denied unless the aircraft doesn't have enough fuel to land somewhere else." With all eyes now looking at him, he added, "For better or worse, people, our country is being invaded. It's time to strap in and get ready for the fight of our lives." The official proclamation by the commander of all forces in North America clearly sent a shiver down the spine of everyone in the room. Not since the War of 1812, more than 200 years ago, had a foreign power invaded America. 15 tense minutes went by. The men and women in the command center watched as dozens upon dozens of U.S. fighters took to the skies to meet the foreign aggressors, when suddenly another missile alarm blared, this time alerting them of a missile attack off the coast of New York. "Where the hell did those missiles come from?" demanded General Tibbets as he made his way over to the officer covering the East Coast. Stammering for a minute, the officer replied, "They appear to have launched from some strike aircraft. We are getting a flash message from the destroyer USS Oscar Austin. They are reporting contact with a group of Mirage 2000 fighters that just appeared off the coast of Long Island. They said the aircraft just fired off 16 missiles. We're still trying to figure out where they're headed."
"Someone figure out what kind of missiles those fighters just launched, and then start calculating what high-value targets are in range of those missiles," Tibbets ordered.
Then he turned to one of his Army officers.
"Major, do we have any missile defense assets in the D.C. metro area, in case those missiles are headed there?"
After taking a deep breath, the Major replied, "The only assets we have in that area are the localized ones at the White House and the Pentagon. But that system can only engage at most 8 targets. It's really only meant to attack a single close-in air threat, not enemy missiles."
"Crap. What about any naval assets? Or do we have any fighters that can engage them?" asked Tibbets.
"We can have the alert fighters out of Langley Air Force Base see if they can engage them, although they are probably only armed with their standard air-to-air missiles, so I'm not sure how much luck they'll have," explained the Air Force commander. Then he reached for a phone to call the base command post to see if they could get in touch with those aircraft. A couple of minutes went by before one of the Air Force weapons analysts waved to get Tibbets' attention. He quickly marched over to the young woman, who seemed to be chomping at the bit to speak. "Sir, I think I know what kind of missiles those are," she explained. "The Oscar Austin said the fighters that launched them were Mirages, so that means they're French fighters. The Mirage 2000D can carry 1 Storm Shadow cruise missile. The missile comes in 3 variants. One is nuclear, but since they fired 16 of them, I believe we can rule out a nuclear attack, as it wouldn't make sense to fire 16 of them at the same target. That leaves the other 2 types. One is a conventional enhanced high-explosive warhead, and the other is an anti-runway cluster munition."
"What about targets? The missiles have dropped down to wave-top levels once they were fired. Where do you think they're heading?" he asked next.
She furrowed her brow. "If I had to guess, I'd say they're sending them to D.C. This whole UN mission is to remove the president, so what better way to remove him than to kill him while he's in the White House or a meeting at the Pentagon? It'd send a powerful message to the world if they could successfully blow up the White House or hit some other high-value targets in the Capitol." She spoke almost nonchalantly, as if she was describing the latest fictional thriller she had read, and not a pending attack that was underway. The sudden realization that the president might be the target of the missile attack caused General Tibbets to reach out to find something to steady himself. He looked around for his watch officer.
"General, where is the president?"
he asked, barely managing to get the words out. Brigadier General Estrada walked over to find the red phone that connected them directly to a 24-hour operator in the Secret Service office. That contact would know where the president was 100% of the time. As soon as the person on the other end picked up, he handed the receiver to General Tibbets, who immediately snatched it.
"This is General Tibbets at NORAD. Where is the president right now?" he asked gruffly.
A short pause on the other end ensued before the voice on the other end replied, "This is Agent Lorien. He's in a meeting at the Pentagon. What's going on, General?"
"Agent Lorien, a cruise missile attack is headed to D.C., and we believe the president may be the target. You need to get the president out of the city now."
He heard a stream of cursing on the other end before the agent asked, "Is it safe to get the president to Air Force One, or do we need to evacuate him to one of the other bunkers?"
"One moment, Lorraine, while I find out what the air picture of the area looks like,"
Tibbets responded. He placed his hand over the lower receiver.
"Is it safe to have the president go airborne, or do we need him to go to ground?"
he shouted for anyone in the room to answer. General Estrada looked at that threat picture and turned back to Tibbets and shook his head. His face was pale. "Sir, there are hundreds of enemy fighters crossing the U.S. border now. They're either engaging American planes or forming up to attack.
We can't guarantee one or more of those clusters of fighters wouldn't go after Air Force One if they saw it get airborne. It would be the prize of a lifetime to shoot it down. How would they know it was going airborne? Demanded Tibbets. He really wanted to get the president in the air so he could stay mobile. General Estrada, who was from the Air Force instead of the Army like Tibbets, explained. Sir, the enemy has their own AWACS aircraft up. Plus, you can bet they have some spotters watching Andrews to see if they can spot that big fat presidential plane taking off. I wouldn't have him go airborne. Not yet. Nodding at the logic, General Tibbets uncovered the mouthpiece to the phone. Lorraine, it's our recommendation that the president go to ground. Do not go airborne. Not yet. Can you get him to Site R? There was a short pause. We'll scramble Marine 1 and get him to Raven Rock. Please keep us apprised if the air situation changes while we get him there. With the president's immediate situation taken care of, Tibbets was ready to return his attention to the task at hand. Suddenly, one of the communications officers announced, Sir, the Vice President is on an SVTC to speak with you. He's down at the Peacock. Tibbets cursed under his breath. The last thing on the godforsaken earth he wanted to do was to get sucked into a meeting right then. He started walking over to the communications terminal where the video conference was set up. Yet another alarm blared. Sir, we have a new missile launch warning. Oh, crap. This one is from the Gulf of Mexico, sir, shouted the same Air Force captain who'd been overseeing the missile warning screens. What kind of missiles are these? What's the target? Demanded General Estrada as he jogged over to the captain. They look to be cruise missiles, like the other ones we saw being launched at San Diego and the Stennis. One batch of missiles appears to be heading toward Texas. We'll have a probable target in another minute. Another batch is headed to Louisiana. Damn! They're going after our bomber bases, shouted an Air Force technical sergeant. General Tibbets ran his fingers through his hair nervously. The sergeant was right. The only military target of value in Louisiana was Barksdale Air Force Base, home of the 2nd Bomb Wing. Tibbets suddenly realized just how bad it would be if they lost most of those bombers on the ground. How long until those missiles hit? General Tibbets demanded. If these are CJ-10 land attack cruise missiles, which they most likely are, then they should reach Barksdale in roughly 60 minutes. It was at that exact moment that Vice President Powers chose to ask him a question on the video teleconference. I don't have time for this, he thought. He answered something that he almost instantly forgot, spitting out his words as rapidly as possible so that he could get back to issuing orders. The Vice President seemed to understand that he was in the thick of it and didn't press further. Turning to look at General Estrada, Tibbets ordered, Send a message to Barksdale and whatever bomber base they're most likely attacking in Texas. Tell them they have less than 50 minutes to get their bombers airborne or in a covered facility before those cruise missiles start to arrive. While they were busy trying to deal with the various cruise missile threats heading toward their facilities, another Air Force officer, who had been monitoring the air situation over the Northeast, suddenly yelped, We have a problem. What's going on? General Estrada asked. He hastily walked over to handle the next fire that appeared to be rearing its ugly head. We've got 2 pairs of Eurofighters that slipped past our air cover at Lake Erie. Our satellites are tracking them. They're currently flying probably about 100 feet above the ground and headed toward Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. In a flash, the general suddenly seemed to realize the significance of what that meant. Get the Secret Service on the phone, now. Tell them we have enemy fighters heading for Marine 1 and the rest of the helicopters evacuating the Pentagon to Raven Rock. Dear God, get fighters over there to engage them now, yelled General Tibbets. He realized there was a real possibility that the president and his entourage might be intercepted by these enemy planes. For the next 10 minutes, they watched as a flight of American F-16Vs were diverted from an attack along the U.S.-Canadian border to speed across the state of Pennsylvania to try and intercept the 4 Eurofighters that were streaking toward the small convoy of helicopters escorting the Pentagon staff and the president to the Raven Rock facility. To their horror, they saw several missiles fired at the lead helicopters. 2 of the choppers were destroyed before the fighters were engaged. The Secret Service immediately redirected Marine One to land at Camp David until the situation was resolved. They had a tunnel system they could use at Camp David to get the president to Raven Rock, so it wasn't like he was going to be left helpless at the presidential retreat. The aerial battle above Raven Rock continued for another 10 minutes as the remaining helicopters did their best to evade the enemy missiles and deliver the designated Pentagon staff to the command bunker. General Tibbets could feel his jaw clenching involuntarily. With 2 of the helicopters shot down, God only knew which of the critical personnel had made it to the facility and which had just died. "General Tibbets, we're getting an emergency message from the Marine garrison at Camp David. They are reporting that they are under attack by an unknown ground force. They're requesting a QRF from anyone in the immediate vicinity of the camp." "What the Who could possibly be attacking them? Where are the closest assets?" shouted General Estrada. He rushed over to the airman manning the emergency switchboard. "The nearest military force is a National Guard armory in Harrisburg," replied one of the officers. "No. Call Andrews and tell them to saddle up the Air Force QRF they have on standby for Air Force One, and get them on some choppers to Camp David now," bellowed General Tibbets. "Tell them to drop everything they're doing and get help to the camp ASAP." With the Army units at Fort Myer already tasked with the evacuation of the Pentagon and the rest of the capital, they had to find another military unit that wasn't already occupied. The Air Force Security Forces QRF seemed like the best option. However, the challenge now was whether they could get to Camp David fast enough to make a difference. Until then, the task of defending the president fell on a small contingent of Secret Service agents and a detachment of Marines at the presidential retreat. The vice president asked Tibbets another question on the SVTC. This time he basically grabbed General Estrada and threw him at the screen so he could get back to work. 8 minutes after they'd made the call to Andrews, and 10 minutes after they'd received the call for help from Camp David, the Air Force told them they had 2 helicopters worth of security forces airmen on the way to Camp David. Another 4 helicopters of airmen were being rounded up to head up there in another 10 minutes. "Sir, I just received a message from Raven Rock," announced one of the operations officers. "They said they just received a message from a Secret Service agent traveling with the president. They have him in the tunnel, and they're on the tram heading to the bunker now." When they heard the news, the room erupted in shouts of joy. A few of them exchanged high fives, relieved that the president had survived the ambush. For his part, General Tibbets let out an audible sigh of relief. The thought of losing the president and the nuclear football had almost given him a heart attack. This new war wasn't even an hour old, and they had nearly lost Sachs in a decapitation strike. Nuke flash, nuke flash, nuke flash. The warning alarms blared. The satellites indicated a possible nuclear detonation had just occurred. The one screen on the side of the big board that was dedicated to monitoring such events was brought up as the main screen, and he zoomed in on the site of the suspected nuclear detonation. "My God, they nuked Raven Rock," someone shouted. Washington, D.C., White House, Presidential Emergency Operations Center. Vice President Luke Powers had been listening to the meeting happening at the Pentagon in the Situation Room when the Secret Service busted in and demanded that he come with them to the Peacock bunker. A sense of panic washed over him. As they briskly walked through the White House to get to the elevator, he saw staffers and others who wouldn't be going down to the bunker with him being guided out of the building, fear apparent in their eyes. As they stopped in front of the elevator, he allowed some of his questions to spill out. "Where's the president? What's going on?" he demanded. The door dinged, letting them know the elevator had arrived. The group piled into the elevator. It wouldn't be coming back up once they got to the bunker. They'd seal it off from the rest of the building and go into lockdown. Turning to look at the vice president, Rick, his head Secret Service agent, replied, "We received an urgent message from NORAD. 16 cruise missiles are headed to the D.C. area. They believe one or more of them are headed to the White House. The president's being evacuated right now with the rest of the senior leadership at the Pentagon to Site R." "My God," he uttered, in a way that sort of seemed like a half-prayer. "Has everyone lost their minds? An attack on D.C.? You can't be serious." Rick's normally stoic face betrayed some of his own personal anxiety at the situation. Vice President Powers suddenly remembered that the man before him had a wife and kids that lived in Arlington. Rick swallowed and cleared his throat. "I'm afraid this isn't a drill, sir," he answered. "It's probably a decapitation strike. We're fortunate NORAD was able to spot the missiles before they hit the city. They could have killed you or the president." The door to the elevator opened, and the agents in front of them stepped forward. Rick gently grabbed him by the arm and guided them out of the elevator toward the next set of doors. They walked through the massive blast doors and then stopped. One of the agents used a key on the elevator, keeping the door open, and the elevator trapped down here with them. This way, no one else could use it to get down to them. With that security measure complete, another agent entered a passcode, and the large blast door behind them began to close. When the door was shut, the locking cylinders built into the massive door expanded out into their steel-reinforced holes as the hydraulic pressure behind the cylinders made sure they would stay locked in place. They were now sealed off from the rest of the world, and unless the White House took a direct hit from a massive nuclear weapon or a specially designed bunker buster bomb, nothing was going to harm them. They made their way down the hallway into a small command room that had a long boardroom-style table and chairs. The place was already bustling with staffers and military personnel who would operate the vice presidential command post, ready to fill in should the president be taken offline or become incapacitated. By the time Luke Powers took his seat at the head of the table, the military members already had the wall-mounted monitors up and running for a secured video teleconference. One screen was dedicated to United States Northern Command at NORAD. Another displayed the National Military Command Center in the Pentagon. A third showed the alternate command post at Site R or Raven Rock. A fourth showed the Congressional Bunker at Mount Weather. And the final screen displayed the United States Strategic Command at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. Unmuting his speaker button, the Vice President spoke. "General Pruitt, what is the status of the President, and what is the status of the attack headed to D.C.? A flurry of activity could be seen on the monitor in the NMCC, where General Pruitt was. He was clearly issuing orders to other people in the room before he returned his gaze to the Vice President and pushed the button to speak. "I'm sorry, Mr. Vice President," he apologized. "We are trying to get the building here evacuated, or at least as many of our folks down to the bunker as possible. Could you repeat your question?" he asked. There was a lot of noise in the background, as well as a sense of organized chaos. Powers nodded. He knew the man must be just as nervous as he was, and Pruitt wasn't sitting in nearly as hardened of a facility as the Peacock. "General, where is the President, and how long until these cruise missiles hit the city?" "We've evacuated the President to Raven Rock. He's on Marine One as we speak. As to the cruise missiles, they should start to arrive in..." He looked off screen at something. 6 minutes, give or take. "Please, Lord, protect us and protect this city," he prayed silently. "Do we have anything that can intercept them?" Powers asked. General Pruitt nodded. "We have 2 aircraft out of Langley moving into position to attack them now. Plus the White House has 4 anti-air missiles. They'll attempt to engage whatever missiles are directed at your position, sir." For a few tense minutes, they listened in as someone patched them into the radios of the pilots that were going to attempt to intercept the missiles.
They could hear the pilots curse. The group of missiles they had been vectored to only had 4 of the 16 that were headed to the city. One of the pilots radioed that he had just fired off 2 of his AIM 9X Block 2 Sidewinder missiles. 30 seconds went by before the pilot whooped over the radio. "Splash 1, splash 2. I say again, 2 enemy missiles down." The other pilot had likewise fired off 2 of his own missiles. 1 missed, the other scored a hit. Before any of them could celebrate, General Pruitt came over the video feed. "Prepare for impact," he shouted. Above the White House, all 4 of the Sidewinder missiles mounted to a launcher on the top of the building fired off at the incoming threats. They all missed. The incoming enemy missiles were now flying at their terminal velocity, which meant the room for error was so minute the Sidewinders never had a real chance at hitting them. While Vice President Powers couldn't hear or feel any of the impacts of the cruise missiles or the destruction of any of them happening outside the bunker, he did see the computer screen briefly shake and hear a thunderous explosion through the Pentagon's video monitor. The screen then went blank, followed by a no-signal code. "We just lost contact with the Pentagon, sir," announced one of the communications officers. Turning around, the Vice President yelled, "Get us a video feed of what's going on outside. I need to see what the city looks like." "Mr. Vice President, we just received a message from the command post at Raven Rock. The helicopter's evacuating some of the Pentagon personnel. Several enemy fighters jumped them," an Army colonel announced. "Marine 1 was able to escape, and they've set down at Camp David. They're going to move the president to the bunker via the tunnel at the retreat." Vice President Powers was in a state of shock and bewilderment at the news. Everyone else in the room shared a nervous glance with each other before they all involuntarily stared at Powers. If the president became incapacitated or was killed, he'd have to step in and assume control of the government and the military. Trying to shake off the implications of what the colonel had just said, Vice President Powers looked at the screen at NORAD with General Tibbets and pressed his talk button. "General, at the moment we can't control what's happening at Raven Rock. I need to know what we're doing to respond to this attack." General Tibbets, for his part, looked a bit frazzled. "Mr. Vice President, we're tracking multiple cruise missile attacks originating out of the Gulf of Mexico, directed at some of our military bases in Florida, Louisiana, Alabama, and Texas. We have 2 cruise missile attacks originating in the Atlantic, heading toward our naval base in Jacksonville and Norfolk, and 4 additional attacks coming from the Pacific. Right now, we're just trying to get as many of our aircraft airborne and out of harm's way as possible. We'll start to respond to the threats as soon as we get more of our fighters armed and airborne." Sensing that his questions were only slowing the man down, Powers said, "I understand, General. Please keep us advised if anything changes or if you need me. I'll try to stay out of your hair while you get things organized." The general gave a polite smile and then moved off camera, presumably to shout more orders and collect more information. Looking at the men and women around him, the vice president said, "I guess we just hang tight and wait." One of the Air Force colonels was on the phone, talking to someone. Judging by the look on Colonel Brian Nodge's face, he was not happy with what he was hearing. Trying to overhear the conversation, the vice president snapped once to get the attention of a couple of other folks nearby, then held his index finger to his lips. "Are you certain it can't be something else?" Colonel Nodge asked desperately. There was a pause. "What about the Russian bombers? Where are they headed?" Luke raised an eyebrow when he heard the words Russian bombers, and so did a few others at the table. Colonel Nodge suddenly realized everyone at the table, including the vice president, had stopped talking and was now staring at him, listening to the one-sided conversation. "Hang on, Ryan. I've got an audience here in the room with me, so I'm going to put you on speakerphone." He hit the appropriate button, then placed the phone back in the cradle. "Who all is in the room with you, Brian?" the voice on the other end asked defensively. "I need to make sure they have the proper clearance before we continue." Raising his voice to be heard from the other end of the table, the VP announced,
This is Vice President Luke Powers. We're in the Peacock under the White House. Everyone in this room has a Yankee white clearance. Identify yourself and speak.
Yes, Mr. Vice President. I'm Ryan Montana from the National Reconnaissance Office. I was telling Colonel Nodge that we believe the Chinese Air Force moved their H-20 stealth bombers to the Canadian Forces base at Cold Lake. I believe the Chinese are going to try and use those stealth bombers to hit Mount Weather and Raven Rock. That last comment got everyone's attention, especially the Secret Service. They had just evacuated the president to Raven Rock, and with the COG now in full effect, most of the congressional leaders were either at Mount Weather or they were nearly there. Leaning forward in his chair, VP Powers asked, "Why do you believe that? And have you told anyone else this yet?" "We've passed the information over to NORAD so they can try and figure out what to do with it. As to why my colleagues and I believe that, well, it only makes sense. The UN is trying to remove President Sachs and yourself. The elements of our government that support Senator Tate have already fled to Canada, and the senator has already set up a government in exile. The fastest and easiest way for the UN to install Senator Tate is to eliminate any political opposition he'd face in assuming control of the government in D.C. Ryan quickly added, "Before you think I'm crazy, please hear me out. When the UN launched a cruise missile attack on Washington, they didn't just try to hit the Pentagon or the White House. They specifically went after the Capitol building and the congressional office buildings. They wouldn't do that if they weren't intentionally trying to kill congressional leaders. As to Mount Weather and Raven Rock, they know that when we institute the continuity of government plan, we'd evacuate the Capitol. They know we'd send the congressional leaders to Mount Weather and the military leaders to Raven Rock. If they could carry out a successful strike on those two facilities after we've initiated the COG, they could wipe out the military and political leadership of the government. It would make it that much easier for Senator Tate and his cohort to assume power." "My God, what have we done?" murmured the Vice President. Rick, the VP's lead Secret Service agent, interjected, "Sir, we sent some of the congressional leaders to the Olney Federal Support Center, just outside the Capitol. Another group of senators was dispatched down to our other facility in Central Virginia, so they aren't all going to be at Mount Weather, if it really is going to be attacked." The VP let out a breath hastily, at least somewhat relieved. If anyone knew where they had sent the congressional leaders, it would have been Rick. While they were talking, the video feed to Site R came alive. "Mr. Vice President, we've just received word from Camp David. The facility there is under ground attack by a hostile force. We don't have a lot of information at the moment, other than they're requesting any QRF in the area to assist them. General Tibbets at NORAD is on it and assures us that additional forces are on the way to the camp. However, we need you to be ready to take over command in case the president doesn't make it to the tunnel that'll take him to us." Powers looked at the man on the monitor, not sure if this was some kind of joke. How could things be going so wrong for them right now? He wondered. He turned to look at Rick, who, upon hearing the news, had picked up a landline to place a call. A few seconds later, he nodded at the VP, letting him know the president's detail was indeed under attack. Looking back at the NORAD monitor, Powers said, "General Tibbets, I know you're a busy man, but we just spoke with an individual at the NRO. He told us there's a high probability that the Chinese have one or more H-20 stealth bombers flying out of Cold Lake. He said the Russians and Chinese bombers may be trying to carry out a decapitation strike against our elected officials and military leaders. Is there any truth to that?" Tibbets paused what he was doing for a moment. "General Estrada, please brief the VP on what's going on and what we're doing. I need to handle something," he said. Then he walked off the screen. If they weren't in the middle of an unprecedented disaster unfolding before his eyes, Powers might have been pretty put off and probably would have ordered the general to stand fast and brief him. but he knew Tibbets was probably trying to organize some sort of defense of the nation, so he cut him some slack. The Brigadier General appeared in the seat where Tibbets had just been. "Excuse us, Mr. Vice President," he said apologetically. "We're trying to put out fires all over the battle space. We haven't even dealt with the ground situation yet, as we're trying to make sure the Air Force doesn't get wiped out on the ground." My God, is the situation really this bad? Powers thought, practically unable to breathe from the strain of the circumstances. "Can you answer our question about what the NRO told us?" the VP managed to say. "Yes, sir. They're right about the bombers. We're tracking 6 blackjack bombers that broke through our air perimeter less than 10 minutes ago. We have faint blips of what we believe to be 4 Chinese H-20 bombers that just started appearing on our radars probably 15 minutes ago." "What? Where are they headed? And what are we doing to shoot them down?" demanded the Vice President, growing more and more exasperated with each passing minute. "We just scrambled the looking glass and the Tacamos in case these bombers are delivering a nuclear first strike. General Tibbets has already moved us to DEFCON 2. We're following procedures on this one. We sent a message to the Russians and to General Mackenzie that if a nuclear detonation is confirmed on U.S. soil, we will retaliate." "Whoa, full stop, General. No one has issued authorization for nuclear weapons unless the President says so, or if he's incapacitated, then it needs to come from me. Is that understood?" demanded the Vice President angrily. He wanted to make sure the generals at NORAD knew there was still a leash on them. "Yes, Mr. President," answered General Estrada, in a tone that suggested he had his tail between his legs. "I didn't mean to imply that NORAD would authorize a strike. We needed to make sure that the aggressors in this situation know that we are ready to deploy our nuclear weapons if needed." "Very well," Powers responded, much more calmly. "Where are these bombers headed, and what are you doing to shoot them down?" General Estrada nodded. 2 of the Blackjacks are headed for this facility as we speak. We've scrambled a squadron of F-22s to go hunt them down. I'm fairly confident the Raptors will find them and take them out before they get in range of any weapons they planned on using. Unless they were going to hit us with a nuke, there isn't much that's going to put a dent in the mountain here. 2 other Blackjacks are actually flying out of Cuba and heading for Eglin Air Force Base. We're a little more concerned about stopping them, since most of our fighters are located along the northern border. I'll have more for you in about 20 minutes. The 3rd set of Blackjacks is headed to Offutt Air Force Base. It would appear the Russians' main goal is to disrupt our command and control capability. It's very standard to the old Soviet playbook, so we believe we're ready to deal with it. As to the Chinese H-20s, we're not 100% sure where they're headed just yet. Our last blip showed them passing over Pennsylvania. Again, we have some F-35s being vectored to their last known positions to try and see if they can't pick up the scent. There's a chance they'll find them as they get closer to them. The H-20s may be stealthy, but they aren't invisible. Suddenly, Powers heard a lot of commotion over the video feed of General Estrada. Not sure what was going on, the VP looked at the other video feeds and abruptly noticed the one from Raven Rock had gone black and was displaying only the words, "No signal," just like the one from the Pentagon. "What's going on, General?" Powers asked. Estrada was looking off camera at something, alarm klaxons blaring in the background. Powers heard several people gasp, followed by a series of angry shouts. He could have sworn he heard someone use the word nuked. "General, what's going on? We just lost the video feed to Raven Rock," shouted the Vice President. Returning his gaze to the video screen, an ashen-faced General Estrada replied, "Sir, we're trying to get confirmation, but right now it would appear Raven Rock was just taken out." The Vice President couldn't say anything for a moment. He realized his jaw had swung wide open in shock, and he snapped his mouth closed. "What do you mean it was taken out? That's a hardened bunker," he demanded. There was a brief pause as Estrada conferred with people around him.
We're trying to get verification, sir. But the satellites are telling us the facility was just hit by what we can only describe as 4 tactical nuclear weapons. Everyone in the Peacock suddenly became silent. A pin could have been heard as everyone took the information in. "What about Mount Weather?" inquired the Vice President. "It's still there. I think our F-35s in their vicinity may have found the Chinese bombers. They're moving to engage them now. We're vectoring some fighters over to Raven Rock to try and get us an independent visual. We'll know in a couple of minutes if they really hit us with a nuke." The image of Estrada was abruptly replaced with that of General Tibbets. "Mr. Vice President, whether Raven Rock was hit by a nuke or a bunker buster bomb, the facility is offline and unable to perform its duties. Our last report of the President's whereabouts was from the last Secret Service agent in his detail to make it to the tunnel alive. They were on the tram traveling to the bunker. If they took that bunker out, it means the President may be dead. We're going to do our best to get confirmation of that over the next 10 minutes, but we're going to need you to assume his role until that happens. Do you have your biscuit card for authentication?" "What? Dead? Authentication? Biscuit card?" thought Powers in a jumbled mess. This was all happening too fast. "Mr. Vice President, we need you to authenticate with your biscuit card," General Tibbets repeated. Yes, I have my card," he finally replied as he reached inside his suit jacket and pulled his biscuit card out. He cracked the plastic enclosure around the paper card and pulled it out. He then read off his authentication numbers, which were verified by another officer at NORAD and confirmed by Colonel Nodge, in the Peacock with the Vice President. With the multi-factor authentication complete, General Tibbets asked, "Sir, we're proceeding with you as the Commander-in-Chief until we can verify the status of the President. How would you like us to respond to this attack?" Still in a bit of shock at what was happening, Powers looked up at the General and took a deep breath. "First, verify that we've hunted down those H-20s headed to Mount Weather and get verification that Raven Rock was in fact attacked by a nuclear weapon. If it was nuked, then we'll begin preparations for a limited counterstrike." Leaning forward so his face looked a bit larger on the screen, General Tibbets said, "Sir, if I may, I'd like your permission to get at least 4 of our B-2s armed with nuclear weapons and airborne. We can place them in a holding pattern over Alaska until we determine if we need to use them. That way we'll be able to rapidly move them to execute a counterstrike if ordered." Pausing for a moment to think about that, Luke nodded. "Okay, General, but also have a couple of B-2s loaded up with bunker busters. If this turns out to be a nuclear detonation, then I still want to go after the guys that did this with our own bunker buster bombs." Tibbets smiled and nodded. He said a few things off camera before he returned his attention to the acting president. A million thoughts raced through Powers' mind. Even though he was a bit more involved than the average vice president, he would definitely be drinking from a fire hose for the next several hours.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.